These women were told that the substances they were putting in their mouth was completely safe. But in another part of the very same company, men were being given lead-lined aprons and ivory-tipped forceps to protect them from it. The women, they weren't even given gloves. In fact, they were instructed to do something unbelievable: put the radioactive substance in their mouths. These were the Radium Girls. In the 1910s and the 1920s, young women were employed to paint watch dials and instrument dials using luminous paint called radium. At the time, it seemed like a brilliant job. Radium was fascinating. It literally glowed in the dark. The women themselves would sometimes unknowingly leave work with radioactive dust on their clothes and in their hair. And to get the tiny numbers perfect, they were instructed to do something called the lip, dip, paint method. They would bring the brush between their lips to bring it to a point. They would dip it into the paint, write the numbers on the dials, then put the brush between their lips again and again, potentially hundreds of times during a shift. And when the women questioned whether this was actually safe, they were reassured that it was. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the plant, people handling radium in laboratory work were taking precautions to protect themselves. So somebody understood that this substance needed to be handled carefully. The women painting the dials just weren't being afforded the same protections. And then the women started getting sick, because every time they put those brushes between their lips, they were swallowing tiny amounts of radium. And radium is particularly horrifying once it is inside your body. Chemically, your body can treat it very similarly to calcium, meaning it can be deposited into your bones. So the thing making these watches glow was now sitting in their skeleton. One of the first women to die was Molly Maggia. It started with problems with her teeth. One became painful and was removed, and then another. But instead of healing, her mouth got worse. Ulcers developed. Her gums wouldn't heal, and eventually the bones in her jaw began to deteriorate. At one point, her dentist was reportedly able to remove part of her jawbone simply by lifting it out. This horrifying condition would become known as radium jaw. Molly died in 1922. She was 24 years old, and she wasn't the only one. Other dial painters began developing devastating illnesses. Some developed severe anemia, others developed cancers. Women who had once been completely healthy were now becoming desperately ill, and they began asking the obvious question: was their job killing them? Remember, the men handling radium had been given protective equipment, but when the women began getting sick, their employer denied responsibility. And the women faced an enormous problem, because how do you take on a powerful company when you're seriously ill, when you don't have much money, and you don't even know if you will be alive to see the end of the case? But 5 women in New Jersey decided to fight anyway. Grace Fryer, Edna Hussman, Catherine Schaub, Quinta MacDonald, and Albina Larice. They became known in the newspapers as the Radium Girls. By the time their case was progressing, some of them were so sick that they couldn't even raise their arms to take an oath in court. Their legal battle became national news because everyone could see what was happening. These women weren't just fighting their employer, they were fighting against time. Eventually the case was settled, but what the Radium Girls achieved became much bigger than compensation. Their fight helped establish that companies can be held responsible when their workers become ill because of their job. Their case became hugely important in the establishment of occupational health and safety protections. Research into what happened to the dial painters helped scientists establish the devastating impacts of internal radiation exposure. Years later, knowledge gained from studying the Radium Girls would even contribute to radiation protection standards, which were used during the Manhattan Project. So when people talk about the Radium Girls, it's easy to just imagine or think of the glow-in-the-dark paint, the deteriorating jaws, because those are the horrifying parts of the story. But I think the most disturbing part is much simpler. Women were putting radioactive paint into their mouths while elsewhere in the same companies, other people were being given protections. Then when they started dying, they had to prove that their work was responsible. Some of them did that knowing that they might not survive long enough to see the outcome. So what do you think? Did the companies genuinely not understand how dangerous this was for the women, or did they understand enough that they should have known better?